In the quiet, sprawling landscape of rural Northamptonshire, the horizon is typically defined by stillness. It is a region where the isolation of the countryside often provides a veil of privacy, a quality that is cherished by locals but exploited by those with far darker intentions. By the final months of 2021, this quiet airspace had become the theatre for a sophisticated game of cat and mouse. The National Crime Agency, NCA, the UK's lead agency against serious organised crime, had begun to detect a troubling anomaly in the skies above the Midlands. Their focus narrowed on a specific site near Corby, a former military base known as Deenethorpe Airfield. To the casual observer, the activity there seemed mundane, but analysts saw a pattern that defied the logic of recreational aviation. Light aircraft were documented arriving under the cover of darkness, touching down on unlit runways, and departing minutes later. These were not leisure flights. They were precise, logistical maneuvers. Intelligence reports began to suggest that these phantom flights were the vascular system of a major organized crime group, utilizing the lack of oversight at smaller airfields to bypass border controls and inject high-value, illicit inventory directly into the UK. The aircraft were effectively ghosts, often unconnected to the registered private owners of the airfields they utilized, leaving little paper trail and even less physical evidence. However, the ground support for these flights left a footprint that investigators could track. By the dawn of 2022, the NCAS surveillance net had identified two primary individuals of interest operating out of Coventry: Richard David Farmer and his close associate, Blaine Benjamin Harvey. Both men, aged 39, did not fit the typical profile of high-level logistic coordinators, yet their movements told a different story. Police radar had flagged Farmer due to a series of inexplicable journeys between his home base in Coventry and the remote vicinity of the Northamptonshire Airfield. Digital forensics, including phone data and travel logs, began to sketch a map of their operations, linking them indirectly to a wider network suspected of importing class A material. As February began, the investigation shifted from passive observation to active, covert surveillance. Between the 1st and the 22nd of the month, agents tracked Farmer's mobile signal with increasing scrutiny. A consistent, almost ritualistic behavior emerged. Farmer would leave Coventry, driving 4 hours to the northeast, loitering in areas that made little sense for a civilian but perfect sense for a smuggler scouting a drop zone. These trips were the dress rehearsals for something significant. The breakthrough came when the NCA secured specific, actionable intelligence regarding a scheduled delivery. The date was set for February 23, 2022. The data indicated a convergence of all key elements: a precise flight plan, Farmer's travel itinerary, and Harvey's logistical involvement. Recognizing the scale of the operation, the agency mobilized a specialized strike team. As the sun began to dip on the eve of the 23rd, surveillance units silently positioned themselves into the hedgerows and shadows surrounding the airfield, waiting for the sound of an approaching engine to break the silence. The atmosphere on the evening of February 23rd was charged with a tension that was invisible to the naked eye, but palpable to the agents concealed in the surrounding darkness. As dusk settled over the landscape, the rural airfield at Deenethorpe transformed into a stage for the culmination of months of intelligence gathering. The silence of the countryside was merely a deception. In reality, dozens of eyes were fixed on the runway, waiting for the distinct hum of an approaching engine. The National Crime Agency had calculated the timing of the drop with precision, and their patience was about to be rewarded. A light aircraft, flying low to avoid unnecessary attention, descended out of the twilight and touched down quietly on the tarmac. It taxied to a halt, a mechanical intruder in the pastoral setting. Almost immediately, the stillness on the ground was broken. Richard Farmer, driving a civilian vehicle, navigated onto the airfield, his headlights cutting through the gloom as he approached the waiting plane. From their vantage points, surveillance teams observed the critical moment of transfer. A single heavy, black-wheeled suitcase was offloaded from the aircraft and hoisted into Farmer's car. It was a transaction that took only moments, yet it represented the final link in an international chain of illicit supply. Simultaneously, Blaine Harvey was detected in the immediate vicinity. While he kept a physical distance from the runway itself, his presence was no coincidence. He was the silent overseer, ensuring the logistics of the handover proceeded without interruption. As Farmer's vehicle turned to exit the airfield, confident that the cover of darkness had protected the exchange, the steel trap of law enforcement snapped shut. Officers from the Northamptonshire Police, acting in coordination with the NCA strike teams, intercepted Farmer's car before it could reach the public road. The arrest was executed with overwhelming speed and tactical dominance, leaving no room for escape or resistance. Inside the vehicle, the black suitcase was recovered intact. When opened, it revealed the true scale of the operation: 50 individual packages, tightly wrapped in brown tape, stacked with professional uniformity. This was not a minor courier run. It was a wholesale importation of high-purity class of product, weighing nearly 50 kilograms. Both men were detained at the scene without incident. The immediate on-site search of the aircraft and the vehicle provided a wealth of forensic opportunities. The seized product alone held an estimated street value of £4 million, a staggering sum that would have fueled significant criminal activity had it entered domestic distribution. Beyond the physical cargo, authorities secured Farmer's mobile device, a piece of evidence that would prove as damaging as the illicit substance itself. Preliminary scans of the phone revealed a stream of messages directly linking him to Harvey, with coded references to collection times that mirrored the flight logs perfectly. The interception was hailed as a strategic victory, a decisive blow against a network that had sought to exploit the vulnerabilities of general aviation. As the suspects were transported to custody, the airfield fell silent once again, but the implications of the night's events were already rippling through the criminal underworld. The NCA had not just seized a shipment, they had dismantled a sophisticated logistical route, proving that even the most remote airstrips were within the reach of the law. The adrenaline of the airfield seizure quickly gave way to the methodical, grinding precision of a major criminal inquiry. By the morning of February 24th, Richard Farmer and Blaine Harvey had traded the open skies for the sterile confines of a police interview room. The National Crime Agency (NCA) had transitioned from a successful interception into a complex financial and digital investigation, aiming to dismantle not just the logistics of the drop, but the entire infrastructure behind it. Under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, both men were subjected to intense questioning. Their initial strategies were divergent, but equally futile. Farmer, confronted with the reality of being caught red-handed, offered a partial admission. He acknowledged his presence at the airfield, but vehemently denied knowledge of the suitcase's true contents. He painted himself as an unwitting courier, a man doing a favor for a friend, unaware that he was transporting 50 kilograms of high-purity class material. Harvey, by contrast, adopted a wall of silence. He denied all involvement, refusing to answer key questions, a tactic familiar to seasoned investigators dealing with organized crime. However, modern policing relies less on confessions and more on irrefutable data. While the suspects remained evasive, the NCAS forensic teams were busy unlocking the digital narratives stored within their seized devices. Farmer's phone, though scrubbed of some data prior to his arrest, yielded a treasure trove of incriminating evidence through advanced recovery tools. Investigators retrieved deleted messages that shattered his defense of ignorance. These were not casual texts. They were coded instructions referencing collections, airfield runs, and the movement of merchandise. One particularly damning exchange, sent days before the operation, read, "Final confirmation for the 23rd. No mistakes this time. Harvey's device proved equally treacherous for the defense. Despite his attempts to distance himself physically from the seizure, his phone's GPS data placed him near Deenethorpe Airfield on at least 3 separate occasions, in the weeks leading up to the arrest. It was a digital footprint that screamed of premeditation and reconnaissance. Furthermore, call logs revealed a flurry of communication between him and Farmer in the critical 48-hour window before the aircraft landed, proving a level of coordination that flatly contradicted his claims of non-involvement. Parallel to the digital forensics, financial investigators began to unravel the suspects' economic lives. The disparity between their declared income and their actual spending was glaring. Farmer, who held no legitimate employment record at the time, had recently made several large cash deposits into his bank accounts. He had also paid off a significant car loan with a single lump sum, a financial capability completely inconsistent with his status on paper. Harvey's records showed similar anomalies, including the purchase of a vehicle worth over £25,000, largely funded through untraceable means. The final nail in the coffin came from the physical evidence itself. Forensic analysis of the black suitcase revealed partial fingerprints that matched Richard Farmer. While no prints belonging to Harvey were found on the case, prosecutors argued this only highlighted his role as the clean overseer, the architect who directs the labor but never touches the product. The NCA had built a multi-layered cage of evidence: digital, financial, and forensic. As the Crown Prosecution Service prepared the charges, it was clear that the unwitting courier defense was about to face an insurmountable challenge. By the autumn of 2022, the quiet investigation in the Midlands had evolved into a high-stakes legal battle at Northampton Crown Court. The courtroom became the arena where two competing narratives would collide: the Crown Prosecution Service's detailed timeline of a sophisticated smuggling ring versus the defendants' desperate claims of ignorance and coincidence. Richard Farmer and Blaine Harvey sat in the dock, facing conspiracy charges that carried the weight of decades behind bars. The atmosphere was heavy, the gallery silent, as the prosecution began to lay out the architecture of the crime. The Crown's strategy was to overwhelm the defense with the sheer volume of synchronized data. They did not rely on a single smoking gun, but rather a mosaic of evidence that, when viewed together, formed an undeniable picture of guilt. The jury was presented with a digital reconstruction of the defendants' movements on February 23. CCTV footage showed Farmer's vehicle entering the airfield mere moments after the light aircraft touched down, a timing so precise it rendered the idea of an accidental encounter statistically impossible. Simultaneously, GPS logs placed Harvey in the immediate vicinity, acting as the invisible conductor of the operation. However, the defense teams fought back with distinct, calculated strategies. Farmer's counsel leaned heavily into the unwitting courier narrative. They painted him not as a criminal mastermind, but as a vulnerable individual who had been manipulated by others. The defense argued that while Farmer admitted to collecting the suitcase, he had been misled about its contents, believing he was transporting legitimate goods, perhaps duty-free items or undocumented cash rather than 50 kilograms of high-consequence, classer material. They portrayed him as a fall guy, a man out of his depth who had been exploited by a shadowy network that remained out of reach. Harvey's defense adopted a more technical approach, focusing on the lack of physical contact. His barrister emphasized that forensic teams had found no DNA or fingerprints linking Harvey to the suitcase or the aircraft. They argued that his presence near the airfield was circumstantial, and that his association with Farmer did not prove participation in a conspiracy. Guilt by association is not guilt in law, his counsel reminded the jury, challenging the prosecution to produce a direct link between Harvey and the illicit cargo. The prosecution dismantled these defenses with the digital witness, the recovered text messages. They projected the decrypted exchanges onto the courtroom screens for the jury to see. Phrases like "drop confirmed" and "landing at 5" were not the language of a man picking up duty-free cigarettes. They were the lexicon of professional trafficking. Financial records further eroded the defense's credibility. The jury was shown evidence of unexplained cash deposits and the purchase of high-value assets that neither man could justify with their declared income. The prosecution argued that these were not the actions of innocent bystanders, but of motivated, profit-driven partners in a criminal enterprise. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the prosecution wove the disparate strands of evidence, the flight logs, the surveillance footage, the texts, and the money, into a single crushing narrative. They submitted that this was not a case of bad luck or manipulation, but a coordinated, premeditated collection designed to flood the UK market with illicit product. The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a tense limbo, the fate of two men hanging on the interpretation of a few crucial hours in a dark field. The deliberation room at Northampton Crown Court is a place where time seems to distort, stretching minutes into agonizing hours for those waiting in the cells below. For Richard Farmer and Blaine Harvey, the 2.5 weeks of legal arguments had distilled their futures down to a single decision. After approximately 8 hours of intense discussion, the jury returned to a hushed courtroom. The foreman stood, and in a few brief seconds the illusion of the unwitting courier and the detached overseer was shattered. The verdicts were unanimous: guilty on all counts of conspiracy to supply, class A material. Sentencing was deferred until early 2023 to allow for the preparation of pre-sentence reports, but the presiding judge made it clear that custodial terms were inevitable. When the court reconvened in February, the atmosphere was grim. The judge's remarks were scathing, dismantling any remaining notion that this was a victimless crime. He described the operation as coordinated, deliberate, and profit-driven, noting that both men had played essential roles in a scheme designed to bypass the borders of the United Kingdom. He emphasized that while they did not fit the stereotype of violent career criminals, their willingness to traffic substances that devastate communities made them just as culpable. The mitigation offered by the defense, financial desperation, peer pressure, and a lack of prior serious convictions, did little to sway the court. The judge acknowledged these factors, but ruled that the aggravating circumstances, specifically the high value of the import and the sophistication of the method, demanded a severe response. Richard David Farmer was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Blaine Benjamin Harvey, whose role was deemed slightly more organizational despite his lack of physical contact with the evidence, received 12 years and 6 months. Together, their failed enterprise had cost them a combined 24.5 years of freedom. But the punishment did not end with incarceration. The National Crime Agency immediately initiated proceedings under the Proceeds of Crime Act. The goal was to strip them of any assets gained through their illicit activities. Investigators turned their attention to Harvey's modified BMW, the Coventry apartment suspected to be funded by criminal profits, and the encrypted devices that had once been their tools of trade. The message was clear: not only would they lose their liberty, but they would also return to a financial zero. In the end, the case of the Deenethorpe drop serves as a stark study in hubris. Farmer and Harvey had attempted to modernize the age-old practice of smuggling by taking to the skies, believing that a quiet airfield and a light aircraft could outmaneuver the surveillance state. Their sophisticated plan was undone by the most basic of errors: personal phones, traceable cars, and a fundamental misunderstanding of modern digital forensics. If criminal enterprise is indeed an art form, as some might romanticize, their attempt was little more than fingerpainting. Now, they have over a decade in a cell to reflect on their masterpiece venture that promised millions but delivered only ruin.